Hi, AppSec engineers. Welcome to this new segment that I like to call Last Week in AppSec. Now, this segment, we're going to be focusing on some of the interesting stories that I have curated and collated from the last week in application security. Now, keep in mind, while this is application security, I do discuss interesting articles, interesting blogs, and stories from application security, cloud security, Kubernetes security, all the areas of interest that I particularly like, especially around threat modeling, AppSec, CloudSec, so on and so forth. I'm just hoping to have a casual conversation where I kind of walk through some of these stories and just give you a little bit of my perspective on some of these stories, these blogs, and some of these videos that I've watched from the last week in application security. So let's get started. Let's start off with the first notable story of last week. I think it was maybe a little bit before last week, but I think it became much more popular last week, which was the Azure ChaosDB attack. So, if you have not followed the Azure ChaosDB attack, it's pretty crazy stuff. In fact, if you look at it, it has as all major vulnerabilities go, it has a logo, and now it also has a blog post. It has a bunch of videos. I think it was showcased in Black Hat and so on. And I think, of course, now Azure has, of course, patched it, and I think they have dealt with it. But let's talk a little bit about the vulnerability. So, ChaosDB essentially is a vulnerability with the Jupyter notebook libraries of the Azure Cosmos DB. So, Azure Cosmos DB is a pretty strong managed database service offering from Azure, from Microsoft. And they apparently have a Jupyter notebook library. I've not personally used it. I've not personally used Cosmos DB as well, but I heard good things about it from a lot of folks in the InfoSec community as well. So the attack essentially kind of works like this. Although I have not run the attack myself, I've not run the exploit myself. The idea here is that you have a Jupyter Notebook extension for Cosmos DB. So Jupyter Notebook is a very popular Python library that allows you to write code, basically Python code, in a notebook style and share that notebook across, maybe publicly or if you want to do that privately. So clearly, to do data operations, a lot of ML, machine learning, and AI folks use Jupyter Notebook, as well as people who want to share and distribute code in Python. Right. So Cosmos DB being I think it's maybe popular with the ML and AI crowd, they clearly have a library that is that they have an extension that is focused entirely on the Jupyter Notebook, and through that, I believe you can gain access to other Cosmos DB instances. So through the Jupyter Notebook extension, you can start to retrieve credentials of other Cosmos DB instances of other customers, right? So there's clearly some kind of an authorization bypass or an authorization vulnerability that has been introduced in that Jupyter Notebook library of Cosmos DB. And as a result, if you are a user of Cosmos DB and if you're using the Jupyter Notebook extensions of Cosmos DB, which I can't imagine is very difficult to set up, you can essentially start to traverse credentials and gain access to credentials from other databases, which are other instances of Cosmos DB that you don't control. So that I think is crazy because obviously that means that all that sensitive data from somebody else's account you can access and you potentially can maintain persistent access. So I imagine that obviously it's a pretty high severity flaw. The researchers were paid 40 grand for this finding, and I think now, of course, I think it's probably patched. Microsoft, I'm sure, does not delay patching some of these things. So this was really interesting. I am going to be posting this link in the show notes and the blog post below. So definitely check it out and see what you can do. Managed database offerings are becoming a very important part of the cloud. And this kind of gives us an idea of how things can go terribly wrong if access control is not restricted in some of these managed database offerings. This is really interesting. Do take a look at the blog post as well. So this is from the Wiz team. So I really congratulate them on the finding. It's a really nice finding. So I think it's pretty cool and the way they've done it. So it's an interesting finding. The next thing I found interesting from last week was not really a blog post or a story per se, but the keynote of Mark Dowd from Hack in the Box Singapore. That was something that I found really interesting. In case you're all wondering who Mark Dowd is a pretty leading voice in the offensive security space, especially with iPhones and things like that. He's been a leading voice, and he's done a lot of offensive security research, and he has a firm that's focused on offensive security research as well. He keynoted Hack in the Box Singapore, and it was a very interesting topic where he spoke about the race between offensive and defensive security. And this was a very different talk from what I imagined that he would do, because I thought he would typically do a very offensive focused talk because he is from the offensive security background. But I think he really balanced out the perspectives really well. So initially, the while it sounded like the race between offensive and defensive was that offensive was winning, this is the narrative that all of us typically hear of, right? Offense is always winning and defense is losing. But if you look at his presentation, he presents a very balanced view of why offense is slowing down, and offense used to be the big dog in the room, clearly, because it was cheap, it was easy, you could get a lot more value for our offense because you could exploit a lot more. Security was not considered while building applications, and as a result, offense kind of thrived over the last 20 years. But if you look at the more recent developments, defensive security has scaled up quite a bit. The asymmetry clearly has been bridged quite a bit, because defensive security has raised the cost of offense. So a lot of times you see that certain ecosystems, the cost of doing offensive security or the cost of identifying offensive security issues have gone up. At the same time, they give you less value for money. So that's one of the things that he speaks about. I'm not going to obviously take you through his entire presentation. You can do that yourself. I've shared the links below, but I just thought I'll highlight some of the key points. The other thing he's spoken about is beyond memory corruption. In fact, if you look at most of the vulnerabilities, the big vulnerabilities that we've seen over the last 15, 20 years have largely been because of memory issues, right? So either buffer overflow and that kind of stuff, where remote code execution happens because of memory issues. Now, this is kind of, I see a few things changing here, especially as the world adopts a lot more memory safe languages like Rust and Go and so on. I think that will change quite a bit. And even besides that, we are looking at more web centric, cloud centric exploit chains today versus memory safe issues that we used to see quite a bit before. I'm not saying it's not going to be there, and I don't think he is either, but I think the focus is going to be more towards these kind of exploits. He also speaks about ecosystem aware exploits, because let's say you compromise an ecosystem like a Facebook application or a particular cloud provider or something like that, you can do lateral movement across the ecosystem. So he's looking at modern exploits or newer exploits becoming more ecosystem aware, and I think we are starting to see that with not just the cloud, but we're seeing it with private providers as well. I think this is something that we're likely to see. So I really think this captures the essence of what we're likely to see in the future. Defensive tooling has definitely gone up. So if you are considering a career in defensive security, it's definitely making more and more sense today than just a de facto career in offensive security that you would have thought of as a security professional even a few years ago. So definitely look at this talk. Even the slides themselves are very good. But even beyond that, you have the video up. I think you need to sift through, because the video is a 7-hour long video. So you probably need to sift through to his presentation and watch his presentation. Of course, I'm sure the other talks at Hack in the Box Singapore have been pretty good as well. So definitely check that out. I found that to be extremely useful. I found that to validate a lot of my thoughts at the state of where the industry is going in the future as well. The other interesting blog post that I came across was by Daniel Garcia, whose work I've been following for a while now. Daniel Garcia was part of the BBVA team. I think now he's out on his own, doing something on his own. But I really liked his blog post about securing secrets in CI systems. Now, this is something that I've done as part of our DevSecOps classes and so on. Secrets are a pain, especially in CI systems like Jenkins or GitHub Actions. He's spoken about how you can apply or secure your secrets in different CI tools. And it's definitely useful if you're looking at a comparison and, of course, looking at different CI tools and how they can store your secrets and sensitive variables. Although I personally prefer just using a purpose-built CI secret system like Vault or something like that to be able to store your secrets and manage it through some kind of a unifying API. But even with that, you'll still need to store some secret in your CI system. So I think it's definitely worth looking at this blog and seeing how you can do that, and some of the approaches you can take, and some of the tools that you have for taking these approaches. So definitely look at this blog. I found this to be very interesting, and I'm definitely going to be taking some of this. I've already applied a lot of this in our trainings and our consulting, but I think there are a couple of points that I took from this blog that I intend to apply for myself and my company as well. The next blog that I found useful from last week was Lachlan Evenson's post on runtime default security in Kubernetes 1.22. Now, this is not something particularly new, right? So basically, it's Seccomp in Kubernetes, right? Now, if anyone has been doing work in the container ecosystem or the Kubernetes ecosystem, you'll realize that Seccomp is not particularly new, but there has been a significant change in the state of Seccomp, especially for Kubernetes, because Docker exited the scene, right? So previously, Docker, a lot of us were using Docker as the container runtime engine. And of course, under that, it would do container D and all of that stuff, run C and stuff like that. But since Docker has now not been a significant part of the Kubernetes ecosystem, Kubernetes directly uses container D or any other OCI container format. The thing that has changed is obviously the Seccomp features of Docker, or what Docker provided, were now missing, right? So clearly, Docker provided a default Seccomp profile. So Seccomp essentially is a runtime security setting that is enabled by default if you're running Docker containers. This does not allow you to access certain dangerous syscalls. So Docker blocks about 60 of 300 plus dangerous syscalls because it considers them dangerous. Of course, they are just syscalls that, if your program tries to access against the Linux kernel, it will not work. So that is good because Docker kind of secured it by default, and you have to, you have to enable an insecure feature if you want it to work. But since Docker kind of went away from the Kubernetes scene, Kubernetes had to bring about a security control themselves, and that's why they've introduced runtime default. So what you can do with the new runtime default feature is you'll need to enable it when you're starting up the cluster, and once you do that, you have a default Seccomp profile that also restricts an equivalent number of syscalls that it considers dangerous. So it has a bunch of dangerous syscalls. You can set it up when you're starting up your cluster. I am not quite sure how this would apply when you're doing it on the cloud. I'm sure the cloud providers would have provided a capability to do that when you're spinning up clusters on EKS or GKE. But this is something that has been introduced in the new Docker version 1.22. I really like the way he's presented it in his blog, where he's spoken about Docker and he's essentially showcased a Docker example and then showcased a Kubernetes example to give you a apples to apples comparison of how it would work. And I thought that was useful, especially with Seccomp. Although I personally don't like Seccomp, I prefer AppArmor, but I think it's still useful because you need to have certain baseline protections anyway, regardless of what kind of runtime security that you use on top of it. So I like this blog. Definitely take a look. And I'm also going to be posting his blog as well as the Kubernetes runtime default feature link as well for you to go over if you're interested. The last blog that I was interested and I really liked reading was around serverless security. Of course, not necessarily serverless security. I think around AWS cloud security in general, especially focused on IAM, which is the three letters that causes you a lot of stress, especially if you're dealing with AWS. So this was about serverless permission boundaries. Now, one of the things that if you're running a serverless stack, one of the expectations you typically have is that, hey, you know what, this is great because I can essentially secure each and every function by giving it only the permissions that it needs, right? So you have plugins. So for instance, let's say you're running 10 functions, each function can have IAM privileges that will only scope it to what they need, or what that function actually needs. Now, this sounds great, and it's possible as well. And I've used this capability when I've deployed and run functions as well. But this gets pretty complicated as you are scaling up your serverless deployment. So let's say you have a large serverless deployment. This gets complicated because you need to define it, and you have stacks, you have cloud formation restrictions and things like that that you run into, and this becomes a little complicated. So the author here has essentially started to explore the concept of permission boundaries. Now, permission boundaries is not particularly a new thing with IAM. It's been around for a while now, and it's quite a useful feature because what you can do is instead of providing a ops team or a deployment team access to the entire IAM permission set, you can essentially cordon off a permission set and say that, look, you may be able to do certain functions in use certain privileges with AWS IAM, but you can't go beyond that. So, for instance, instead of doing S3 colon star, you can do S3 colon get object, put object across the AWS account. Right? That's fine because the permissions, even though it might be compromised, are still restricted to get object, put object, or something equivalent. So the idea is to add some kind of a fence around the possible permissions that can potentially be abused. Now, is this perfect? Obviously not, because it still means that you have scope to play within those permissions, and those permissions are quite large, depending on the kind of permissions that you offer or the kind of permissions that your stack needs. But it's definitely an interesting approach to reduce the blast radius of your attack, right? Because you are really looking at permissions that you're not giving entire access to your ops team, and you're not blocking them by having them to go through a cloud security team every single time to provision every single type of permission that they need. You're essentially creating a fence which is saying that do not go beyond this. Whatever permissions you need, you can apply, and you can automatically apply as part of your stack, but do not go beyond this. And that, I think, is quite a sensible approach to start with. You obviously still need to do a lot more IAM access analysis, which you will need to do to secure your account better, but this is definitely one of the good ways of getting started with permissions, with permission boundaries. I thought it was a useful blog. I really like the visualizations in the blog as well. Do take a look at it if you have the time as well. That's it for last week in AppSec. If you liked this video, do click on that like button and consider subscribing to my newsletter, because you will start to get weekly updates of this video and, of course, the blog that's going to follow with all the links and descriptions and so on. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next week of last week in AppSec. Thank you very much.